Thanks so much for joining me for this Introduction to Qualitative Research webinar. My name is Kathrin Schumacher. I'm a Senior Research Manager from Zeldis Research. Zeldis is a market research firm located in Ewing, New Jersey. We focus mostly on pharma and financial services research and have extensive experience in both the qualitative and quantitative space. However, for this webinar, I'm going to be focusing on the qualitative side of things. This is an excerpt of a presentation that we do year over year at the university, the local university, TCNJ, here in Ewing, New Jersey. And the learning objectives are really just to define qualitative research. What is it? How does it compare to the quantitative research that we're all familiar with? When is it used? When is it not used, more importantly as well? To learn about different qualitative research methodologies and techniques and their respective pros and cons, just again to understand when qualitative research is best employed. And then I'm going to close out by just walking through a workflow, a typical workflow for a qualitative project, just to give you an idea of how things are set up and what pieces of the puzzle happen when as you do a qualitative project. So without further ado, we're going to start out by just defining what is qualitative research. And I'm going to put it in the context of quantitative research, which I think most of you are familiar with. Qualitative research really aims to answer that question of why or how or which ones. It's typically exploratory in nature, and it's really a powerful methodology or powerful research methodology when you're looking to get insights into motives or attitudes or perceptions or understanding how people feel about something. Unlike quantitative research, though, the results are not statistically significant, and they don't provide that numerical answer that you would be looking for example, with a quantitative research kind of question. So for example, if a client is looking to understand why are certain features of a certain product of most interest, and which way do clients see using the product? What sort of role does the product play? In which way does a specific advertisement, or maybe a paper advertisement, maybe an ad, how does it encourage millennials to fly JetBlue, for example, or how does it encourage people or not encourage people to do certain things? So it's really getting at that why or how, and we'll get into the richness of qualitative research in just a little bit. In contrast, quantitative research answers what and does something happen a certain way. It's a yes or no. It's much more. Well, it's much more. It's a quantitative number. It's mathematical analysis that you can apply to the answers that your respondents are giving you. You're going to find out that 80% of the people liked a certain thing. What you're not going to find out is why they liked it. So again, quantitative is using that mathematical analysis to come to a conclusion of what do people like, and then the qualitative research is answering that question of why, giving that color and context of why something is perhaps preferred. So let's look at how these two things compare on a bunch of different characteristics. Let's start up by sample size. So sample size, you can see I've got big and small, so I've quantified them somewhat. So let's look at the quantitative research side of things. We're talking about bigger sample sets, so 100 and larger, typically much larger. We're talking in the mid hundreds, so in the 3, 4, 5, 600, and larger studies in the thousands. So we're talking about large sample sets. On the flip side, qualitative research is really typically much smaller. You're talking to smaller subsets, on average between 16 and 36 people. So you can see the contrast there. Now let's look at the type of questions that you see in each of these different types of research. On the quantitative side, you have closed-ended questions. The yes, no, the 5-point scale, satisfaction scale, 0 to 10. Those kind of things where the respondent is picking just one response or a couple of responses from a list of offered options. Qualitative, as I mentioned earlier, is really getting at that why, so it's very open-ended. So you might ask somebody why they liked something, or in which way did it impact the way they felt when they read or when they saw a specific advertisement. And there's no set answer. It's how the individual that you're speaking to is reacting to something. So it's observational. It's very open and flexible. Administration, very different approaches there as well. Administration on the quantitative side, you're typically looking at a self-guided, often online kind of survey where somebody's going through a set of questions and answering the questions on their own. Qualitative is administered by a moderator, somebody who has very specific interviewing skills, who has been trained at talking to people, carrying a discussion on with them for maybe an hour or 2 hours, and getting at the very specific questions, having them open up, and we'll talk about getting respondents to open up later on in this webinar, but having them talk about how they feel, or getting into their emotional mindset or their perceptions of certain things. But it's a moderator who's guiding the actual research. Then we've got tools of the trade. Quantitative, we're talking about questionnaires, panels, statistical analysis programs such as SPSS or Excel, or those kind of things can be used as well. Qualitative, we'll get into this in more detail, but we're talking about things like screeners, discussion guides, recordings, videos. So the tools of the trade are even very different. Type of research. So we've got on the quant side, we have causal and relational. And then, as I mentioned, again, exploratory on the qualitative side, exploratory, voice of the customer. What are they saying? It's directional. So typically what I say with qualitative is I'm doing this research to help my clients make better decisions or narrow things down, especially early on in a product development cycle or in an ad development cycle. And we'll look at some examples of that later on as well. And then finally on this page, we're looking at the type of analysis. So quantitative, as I mentioned, statistical, it's summation. You're coming up with certain percentages of likes and dislikes, or on a scale of 1 to 5, how many people said that they were very satisfied or satisfied, whereas qualitative is much more subjective and interpretive. I, as a researcher, will be listening to people or talking to people either in a one-on-one setting or in groups, and be interpreting what they're saying, and try to tell a story for my client to better understand what they're feeling or what their experience is. So for this webinar, we're going to be focusing obviously on the right-hand side, namely the qualitative research. So let's look at some advantages of qualitative research. The first, and I've mentioned this a few times, is that the in-depth details that you're able to get from respondents when you speak with them. If I'm on the phone with a respondent for an hour, I'm able to get into some really rich detail and delve into certain things that they're saying and ask them why and in which way, and give me an example. And it allows them to elaborate on what their answer is, rather than just saying yes or no and not providing any more color. In a qualitative research setting, you're getting into that in-depth detail that the respondent can provide you by probing in further and asking further questions, so that you really get an understanding of what they're saying. It's flexible and fluid. As I mentioned, it's not limited to those rigid, predefined responses that you have in quant, the 5-point scale, but it is much more open. So if somebody says something interesting that's relevant to the research, I can delve in and get some more color. Also, methods can change during a study. So if we're finding that something isn't working, we're not getting the kind of color that we want, we're able to maybe tweak things while the study is ongoing. So maybe the first group, this one thing didn't work, but let's try something else with the next group, with the next interview. That gives it that flexibility to adapt as we're discovering things during the course of the study, something that's not so easily done in the quant side of things. It uncovers the human experience, and it's very observational based. I, as a moderator, have to really pay attention not only to what people are saying, which is obviously very important, but also their body language or how they're reacting to certain things, because that can tell you a lot about how they're feeling as well. So again, it's just getting into that experience or their feelings and their perceptions, and digging in and probing and finding out exactly where they're coming from. And oftentimes folks aren't so good at explaining themselves, and therefore we have lots of different techniques that I'll get into later on in the presentation on how we get people to open up so that we can uncover that human experience. And one of my favorite is that it's creative. It allows I, as a moderator, but also the respondents, to get creative. We encourage them to express themselves. We give them creative exercises to help them open up, and really to get that authentic response, something that isn't canned. Something that gets them to think about why they do a certain thing a certain way. Why do they, like something or not like something? Why do they prefer a credit card with these features versus those features? And just really getting into their emotions. And there's some creative techniques that we use as moderators to help them open up. What qualitative research can't do? So let's look at some disadvantages. As you may have guessed from what I said earlier, qualitative research is directional. It's not easily measured. So if I'm talking to 20 people, it's just 20 people, and I'm getting some directional feedback, and qualitative research is great for the attitudinal, the perceptual, the belief differences that I might find, but it doesn't mean that that can be projected onto a larger population. That's what quantitative research is really for. But it is directional. It gives that initial sort of hunch, or initial, if they're looking at 4 different product concepts or 4 different ways of positioning a product, it gives my client an idea of what's going to work and what's not going to work and how things can be tweaked. So again, it allows them to make better decisions. And as I mentioned earlier, qualitative research is not statistically representative. Although I have a lot of clients who often want to make it representative, it is not. We just can't say that the ways a certain small set of clients are responding is reflective of the entire client population. But again, it's directional, and it gives them more information to make better decisions. So what I'd like to do now is take you through this happens to be a product life cycle. Similar things can be, applied to like a messaging life cycle, or a website design life cycle, that kind of thing. So let's just consider this product life cycle, which many of you are maybe familiar with. We have 4 basic buckets. We've got development, the launch, the growth, and then the maturity and the decline of the product. And as you can see, in general, the arrow on the bottom shows that things at the beginning, in the development phase, and a pre-launch phase, let's say, is much more open. It's very exploratory. And then as you move to the right, things become much more concrete or more structured and defined. So by the time a product launches, it's quite defined what features it might have. And then as it grows, again, it's already a defined product, so it's much less exploratory than it was early on, when a company that's putting together a credit card, or a company that's thinking about putting up a new vitamin product, they have so anything is possible at the beginning, or almost anything, I should say. And then as they come through the product life cycle, things become much more narrow and less exploratory and less flexible as well. And as you might guess, quantitative research is mostly used, or not exclusively, but it's very strong when it comes to early on in the product life cycle, or in the life cycle of messaging, or whatever it happens to be. So this is where qualitative research helps make sense of that exploratory data, trying to understand what direction should we take. How should we position this product? Is it going to resonate the most if it's positioned in one way or in another way, or do both ways not work, and we have to consider something completely new? So that's where qualitative research really is most effective. Doesn't mean that it's not used at any other point in time in the product life cycle or messaging life cycle, but this is where you'll often see qualitative methodologies applied. Whereas later on, when the product design or the messaging design is more clearly defined, that's when product owners want to know the more measurable things. They want to understand so that they can forecast better, so they can tweak the design even better. So that's where they start looking at more quantitative methodologies that are looking at percentage of people who like certain things, or very specific results related to product feature sets, for example. So let's look at, I'm going to keep this product life cycle up, but I'm going to put it in context of some different kinds of research that you might do at different points in the product life cycle. This is by no means exhaustive, but just to give you an idea. So early on, under development, for example, I've got concept testing or prototyping, website wireframes, and market landscape are some examples. And I bolded the ones that are typically done in a qualitative way. So we might have a concept test where a client is looking at an annuity product, and they have 3 different thoughts on products, and they have different features, and it's very conceptual at that point in time. It's not very closely defined, but you might use that concept to talk to financial advisors, for example, to get an idea of which one is going to most resonate with them and why. Again, getting to that why, to give the client an idea, okay, of the 3 concepts, 1 really didn't do well, 2 are potentially worth pursuing. So again, it's that narrowing it down in the development phase. Prototyping is the same thing as the name implies. Website wireframes, a company that's putting a website together, typically does a test of their wireframes, which is like a really rudimentary website, and they'll test that to see how easy is it to understand what the flow is. Do people understand where to click, how to get onto the next page, how to do what they have to do on the website? So this is early stage development, again, when things are very exploratory and not clearly defined. And then in the launch, I've highlighted a couple other very common qualitative type projects. Positioning, where once you have a product, how do you position it? How do you talk about it to your clients? And positioning is interesting because people always want to think about it as advertising, but positioning is just getting to understand, do I talk about the ice cream as something that's rich and creamy, or do I talk about the ice cream as something that's cool and refreshing? So they're talking about ice cream, but you're talking about ice cream in two different ways. So you, in a qualitative sense, you might do a positioning study where you're trying to figure out how best to talk about a specific product. Ad testing is very similar in that sense. And then, as you see, there are other ones that are quantitative. Forecasting, pricing, segmentation, performance tracking, satisfaction. Once something's in the field, you understand how satisfied your clients are. So those are things that are typically done in a quantitative sense. Again, there's no hard and fast rule, and there are exceptions to all of these things. It doesn't mean that quant can't happen earlier on in the product life cycle, but this is just to give you an idea or to reinforce that early on in the product life cycle, it's much more exploratory. And that's where qualitative research typically is most effective. And then as you get on in the product life cycle where things get more finely defined, that's where quantitative research typically is applied. So what are these different qualitative research methods? So I've listed 5 here, which are the typical ones. We've got focus groups, in-depth interviews or IDIs, ethnographies, web or mobile usability, and bulletin boards. So let's start up with the traditional one, which is the focus group. And they can be in person or virtual. And it's a discussion with 6 to 8 people typically in a group. It's led by a moderator such as myself, where we follow through a discussion, typically 1.5 to 2 hours long, where you chat with the group about whatever the topic happens to be or the objective of the research is, and cover many different areas. And it's intended to be very discussion based. So you make sure everybody's feeling very comfortable in opening up, and you have this discussion for the 2 hours. And this is the period of time where you allow them to be creative, where you encourage them to open up and really get into their perceptions and their emotional connections or the behavior to a certain product or a certain message. Can be done in person in a focus group facility. It can be done virtually online, where you basically have a bunch of different talking heads on the screen and the moderator as well. And everybody sees each other, and you're basically talking, but you're just not in the same physical room. And we'll talk about the pros and cons of some of these, but I'll just introduce what they are first. Next is the in-depth interview, or the IDI. This is my personal favorite because it's a chance to really get to know one person and delve into their feelings, their perceptions. It's typically an hour. Well, it can be between 30 minutes and an hour, depending on the research. But it's a one-on-one interview where you're talking with one individual. This is great for executives, experts, in person, online, on the phone. There are many different ways of doing an IDI, but it is typically used when you really want to get deep into a specific topic. Ethnographies are like a cousin to the IDI. They are an IDI. They are a one-on-one interview typically. However, they're different in that they are conducted at the respondent's house, office, or some sort of native environment. And the idea is that you're not only talking to somebody, but you're also observing them in their natural environment. So for example, if I'm talking to small business owners about their accounting software, for example, by going on site, I get not only a chance to talk to them like I would over the phone, but I also get to see their work environment. How do they engage with the software they use? Where do they store their paperwork? How do they, what does their office look like? How does it function? And it gives you another layer on top of just hearing what they say, but you also observe how they are, what they're doing while they're in the office, and how they're engaging with that accounting software. So that's what ethnographies are. Next, web and mobile usability. This is usability is a way of testing how well a mobile app or a website is functioning. So a respondent is given a set of tasks to complete, and then I, as the moderator, observe to see if they understand what they're doing. Is it hard? Is it easy? Where do they stumble? How can the website be improved? And then last but not least is the bulletin board. It's an online forum. For those of us who are older, similar to Yahoo groups, people just pop in. You're able to have a discussion with multiple people at the same time, and they're able to type their answers. It's not a verbal engagement or interaction, but they are answering questions while they're online. So let's look at a really quick pros and cons of different types of research methods. So I just picked 3 main ones: focus groups, bulletin boards, and the in-depth interviews or IDIs. So focus groups, pros: very interactive. Respondents really can build on each other's ideas. It's great for brainstorming or idea generation. So if you're looking to get some new product ideas out of a group of people, it's a great way to get a group of people together who are able to build on each other's ideas, sometimes agree. I always encourage people to disagree as well, because you always want to hear different opinions from different folks. And it also gives the client an opportunity to observe their clients in person, which they can do, either in person in a real focus, in a in-person focus group, or online. They can watch and really see who their clients are, and it gives them context of who their clients are, how their clients talk about their product or talk about their brand. And I'm always amazed at how eye-opening it is for my clients to see their clients. Cons: can be relatively expensive, time-consuming because there's travel often involved if you're doing in-person groups, and it's geographically narrow for the in-person groups. For example, if I'm doing a project with focus groups and I'm doing them in Philadelphia and Chicago and Denver, then I'm talking to people in those geographies versus nationwide. That's somewhat mitigated with online focus groups, because there you have people from all over the country or world who are joining you for the online focus group. Bulletin boards, pros, are that they really support a deep discussion. So for example, if you have something that's very technical, that's hard to describe, within a couple of minutes in an online group or a focus group, bulletin board allows somebody to read something that's very detailed and react to it. It's asynchronous, time and place, so it doesn't matter if somebody logs in at 4 a.m. or 10 a.m. or 2 p.m. They can log in at any time that's convenient for them. So it really drives engagement from their perspective, because it allows them to engage when they want to versus having to be on the phone or in a group at a specific time. Typically lower cost, and then it also offers this thing called longitudinal insight. So you can have a focus group, a bulletin board that might last over a month, where somebody's having a chance to engage or interact with the product, and then learn a little more, and then check in the following week, and then sort of make your way and learn things about their experience along the way. Cons: they have more time to think about what they're going to say, so there's less off the top of mind kind of feedback. It's limited probing. As a moderator, I can't continually it's harder for me to ask the whys and the give me an example of kind of questions. And there's less interaction with the respondents, so it's not a very good thing for brainstorming. In-depth interviews, like I said, it's detailed, very detailed, great for technical discussions, especially if you're talking to somebody like a medical professional or a financial advisor, somebody who has a lot of very specific technical knowledge. And you don't have that group pressure, so if you're talking about something that's a little more sensitive, in-depth interviews are very effective. And again, I can't stress that enough, for the detailed content that you're able to get. Cons: they can be time-consuming. If you have to do 20 1-hour interviews, much more time-consuming than doing one bulletin board with 20 people. And it's not effective for brainstorming or idea generation, because it really depends on that one person who you're talking to. You might have somebody very creative, but you might have somebody who's not very creative at the same time. So regardless of the method that you use, whether it be focus groups or bulletin boards or in-depth interviews, the quality of the questions that are asked are really key. And that's what I always say: the quality of what's obtained from the qualitative research is only as good as the discussion between the moderator and the people in the room. So those are the respondents. So if we get people in the room and they're the right people, but we don't ask the right questions, or we don't engage them and have them really open up, then some opportunities are lost. So here are three main things that I try to keep in mind as I'm thinking about questions that I want to ask and how I want to ask them. And the first one's more about structure of how I want to ask and how do I want my discussion to flow. And what's really key is to start out broad. And that's how I typically start my discussions with my groups or my individuals, assuming that I have enough time. But starting out broad and getting them to warm up to talking with me, talking with the group, getting them comfortable. And so if I eventually want to get to talking about a specific vitamin product, I might talk about, health in general to start out with, just to get them to open up. And then as the discussion progresses, I'll narrow things down. And as I wrote down here, it helps the respondents warm up. It's, not everybody's comfortable jumping into a group of 6 people that they don't know and just talking about whatever they are asked about. So it gives them a chance to get used to the scenario as well, or the setup. The second really key thing is to avoid those closed questions, the yes, no, the questions that aren't going to give you the detail and the context and the color that you're looking for. And if you happen to ask yes, no questions or closed-ended questions, it's always key to follow up with a probe. Do you like this, or like, do you like this message, yes or no? And then they might say yes, but then always following up, in which way? What is it about the message that you really like? What really resonated with you, or what didn't resonate with you? Give me an example. And those probes are a way of getting, again, deeper into that yes or no, because yes or no we can get at the end of the day from a quantitative research. So qualitative is really getting into the color and the context of yes and no. And then it's really important to ask questions that provoke thought or make them think. And I love when respondents say, oh, I never thought about that. And then they give an answer where they really started to think about why they like something, or why they have a certain travel behavior, or why they do things a certain way, rather than giving that pre-programmed answer. And I look for ways that are going to help them sort of jog their memory, or give a creative response, or a very thoughtful response, or really delve into their emotions and their perspectives. That is key to getting good questions, but also is the most interesting stuff. And then the clients also get into the perspective of their clients much more effectively. So a major challenge, as I mentioned, for qualitative research is getting the respondents to open up and share their attitudes and their motivations, especially with a stranger. And so it's not only getting them to open up, but it's also getting them to think about things that they haven't necessarily thought about, or things that they might not even be aware of, or emotion that they might not think about in association with a specific brand. So really delving into that. And there are a couple of techniques that we use in the qualitative research world. And the first is pre-work or homework. And this is a warm-up exercise of some sort as well, you could say. It's an assignment that we send out to the respondents prior to the research, and this gets them to think about the topic that we're going to be discussing in the groups. And it gets them prepared. And so it not only gets them to think about it, but it also gets them more engaged with what we'll eventually be doing in the group. So what we find here at Zeldis with homework is that when you send a homework assignment to respondents, they're in fact more likely to show up and participate because they've already invested some time, or maybe thought, oh, this is an interesting topic, I'm going to do the homework, and therefore are more likely to show up to the research as well. It also gives them something to talk about when they come to the group, again, making them feel a little more comfortable in talking to a group of strangers. And then the second are creative exercises, or projective techniques that get to those deeper feelings that are otherwise hard for the respondents to articulate, as I wrote here. We as humans are good at giving the tactical responses, but not so good at talking about emotions necessarily. So let's look at these two techniques that I use to help get respondents to open up. So let's talk about the pre-work. This is the homework, the jogging the respondents' memories before the research starts. And here I just provided a few examples. For example, you might, if you're doing a research on a travel planning app or a travel planning experience, you might have them map out a recent travel planning and purchase experience. Have them draw it. Have them highlight things that they liked and they didn't like, or how they felt at different parts of the research of that travel planning process. In thinking about their financial priorities, have them put it on a financial plate. What big portions do they have? What small portions do they have? And here I actually showed you an example on the screen. That's a little bit of a mock financial plate that I put together that show, somebody might have a large portion of financial planning that goes to retirement now or everyday expenses, and then a smaller portion that's for travel and fun or paying off debt or extra for the house kind of thing. So it just gives you an idea as a researcher how they prioritize things, and it gives them a fun way of thinking about it as well that they then can talk to when you meet in a group. Another one, exploring issues regarding organizations, like having them take pictures of their garage to show what they find easy and hard to organize, and how do they feel about part of their garage that might be a little bit unorganized, and what they would like to do about it. So just fun ways to get them to think about their experience, that human experience again. Projective techniques are techniques that we do while we're in the groups, and we're going to do some of these shortly, but just to introduce them to you, again, just to delve into their feelings or their uncanned responses, that emotional response that we're looking for. So here are some examples of techniques that we often use. One is using images and pictures is a great way for people to open up. Many of us are visual thinkers and visual learners and thinkers, so communicating with images and pictures is easier and can be really super powerful. So some examples are, for example, a picture or image association, doodling, having them draw things, and then always stressing that it doesn't matter how good the drawing is, just having them doodle something so that they articulate how they feel while they're drawing something, or using word bubbles, having them, put a word bubble on a little character and say, how did you feel when, and then give them a scenario. Or mind mapping is another great example of using images and pictures. Next, understanding feelings and emotions. Again, delving into that emotional response. And a very common exercise there is called laddering, and we're going to do an example of that shortly. But laddering is basically asking them, okay, why do they do something? And then how does that make them feel? And then how does that, just delving into how does that make them feel over and over again. It often feels like you're asking the same question, but getting past the tactical and getting into the emotional of why they do certain things. Blob tree will show you a quick example of that too. Again, getting them to project a feeling onto something that they're looking at. It's actually, blob tree is also a use of an image and picture. Brand personification is a fun exercise where you have somebody personify a brand. You might say, well, what does Adidas look like? If you were to ask them, ask them what Adidas looks like as a person. What gender do they have? What color hair? How they dress? What kind of car do they drive? And putting all those things together personifies the brand, but also tells you a lot about how they feel about the brand. I did that recently with a medical product or medical brands for over-the-counter product, and it was amazing to see how different brands had very different personas with the respondents that we spoke to. And then you also fill in the blanks, a great, very easy way of getting people to delve into their emotions. And then role playing, a nice hands-on experience to get respondents to get engaged and have them do certain things like a card or product sort. You might have them have a bunch of products on a range where you have like things that are maybe less expensive and more expensive, or more likely to help them with oily hair buildup and less likely to help with oily hair buildup. But basically giving them tactical things where they can move things around and place things, and then tell you why they put products where they put products on a scale, or why they picked to organize content a certain way. But again, it's an engagement thing when it comes to role playing, getting them to get out of their seat and really engage and think about what they're doing. It's a creative way for them to express themselves. So let's give some of these a try. The first is fill in the blank. So if I say, when I have financial well-being, I feel, and then I'd leave it blank. And what I would do is I would probably print these out, and I'd have maybe 3 like this. I feel, I wish, I need. And I might print these out on a piece of paper and tell my respondents, fill this out. Don't say anything, but fill it out, and then we as a group would respond and talk about it, rather than having people shout things out. That way people commit to what they've said. And that this fill in the blank is a really effective way of having them finish the sentence of when they have financial well-being, how do they feel, what do they wish, and what do they need? And those 3 really simple questions can spawn a very robust discussion. Another one, I mentioned this earlier, the laddering. Here, for example, what do you feel are the key benefits of working out and staying fit? So why is that important to you? Might give you the very canned responses. It's important to me because it keeps me healthy. It means that I can run the 5K. It means that my clothing fits better. But then you want to get into like, how does it make you feel? Like it's important to you because of those reasons. But how does it make you feel? Well, it makes me feel fitter. I feel more energetic. And then you might say again, well, and how does that make you feel? How does being fitter and more energetic make you feel? And you might end up getting to a place where like when I'm fit and I'm going to the gym or I'm exercising a lot, my clothing fits better and I feel much more confident. And so you eventually, uncover that underlying emotion that they associate with working out and staying fit. And you can do that with many different things. But the idea is that it's a very repetitive exercise, just getting them to think about, okay, great, how does it make you feel? How does it make you feel? And asking the question over and over again so they get to that underlying emotional feeling that they have. I mentioned blob tree earlier. So this is what a blob tree looks like. And I might ask them, pick out a character that best describes how you feel when you take vitamins. And so the idea is that they would look at the different blobs, and you'll have different responses. And you might have some people who like the guy hanging on the lower left-hand corner. He's like, oh, I don't like taking vitamins. They don't taste good. And that might be the kind of experience that somebody has with taking vitamins. Or somebody might say, like the two blobs that are sort of arm in arm, like it makes you feel protected. But you basically have them project that feeling that they have when they take vitamins onto one of these images and explain why. Again, qualitative research is all about the why. Why do they feel a certain way? And this blob tree is a great way for them to not just answer your question of, how do they feel when they take vitamins, but to project it onto one of these blobs and then explain why that's the blob that's most relevant to how they feel when they take vitamins. One more quick example before we go into the last few slides of this presentation. This example is an image sort or picture association, pardon me. And I might ask, which images do you associate with brand of, whatever brand it is. In this case, I was doing it with the College of New Jersey. Which of these pictures do you associate with the College of New Jersey? And I typically, when I'm doing a picture association, I'll spread the pictures out on the table and have the respondents stand up so they can, again, get more engaged and pick picture that they most closely associate with a brand or with an experience or with whatever we're testing. And then have them explain why. Why is it that the man that's climbing up the mountain makes you you associate that with the brand of the College of New Jersey, and you'll get into their experience of maybe it makes them feel like they're achieving something or whatever it happens to be, but it gets them to think about a brand experience or whatever it is from a different angle without just point blank talking about that brand. I might also have them highlight the one that they least associate with the brand, just to get both the pros and the cons of the brand association. And this brings us to the life cycle of a qualitative research project. And this is, there are 5 different stages that I'm going to highlight. The first is defining the objective. And typically the client does this, or ideally the client does this. They come to us with a very specific objective that they want to research. And it's my job as the researcher to understand what the client wants to learn and understanding what the key questions are that he or she want to answer. And they do shift. You might start a project and then as things move, your objectives might shift somewhat, although you don't want them to shift too much. But it's important for you as a researcher to understand what a successful project looks like from the client's perspective. What are the key questions that they need and want answered from this research? And it's key that you as a researcher try to keep things within the realm of those objectives and not completely move too far from the main objective that the client is trying to reach. So avoiding scope creep is what that's called. So keeping things somewhat flexible, like there might be some shifts here or there, but staying mostly on track in terms of the objectives that this research is trying to address. Next, you have recruiting. So the recruiting process for qualitative research, you design something called a screener. And the screener is written, it's very much like a survey. And this recruiting screener is used to find the right people. Because as I mentioned earlier, it's important to ask the right question, but it's also extremely important to have the right people or the right respondents in the room, either in the focus group room or on the phone. It's important to have the right people because you want them to be knowledgeable of what you're talking about. You want them to be able to answer the question. So if you're talking about a small business product, you need to have small business owners in that group, not somebody who's from corporate. If you're talking to a group of people about a specific annuity product, you want to make sure that they have experience with that product so they can answer the questions that you'll be asking. And so that's where recruiting comes into play. Writing a screener in the like a screener that allows us to recruit the right people for the research. The discussion guide is the next step, and that is, we talked about the questions earlier, and this is where the discussion guide is basically writing that flow of questions that are going to be covered in the focus group, on the bulletin board, in the in-depth interview. And so this is where you want to understand, what do I need to cover? How much time do I have to cover it? How is it going to flow? Again, it's that process of starting very broad and then narrowing down the questions to get to the crux of the research. And then making sure it flows, making sure that you have enough time to cover everything. So the flow is key, because the flow almost has to feel natural to people you're talking to. It shouldn't feel choppy, and it shouldn't feel like you're just asking questions, but you're really having a discussion. That's why it's called a discussion guide. Then it's time to field the research. And fielding the research in qualitative means you're going to go have run the focus groups. You're going to call the people on the phone. You're going to field the bulletin board. And so that's going into the field. So after all of this work of defining the objectives, of recruiting people, writing the discussion guide, you're ready to go into the field and talk to people. And this is where, again, we talked about flexibility of qualitative research. It is possible that you might get into field and then realize that, oh, there's certain things that we need to tweak in the discussion guide, or there are certain, maybe we'll add a couple of projective techniques that might work really well once things have started. So again, speaking to the flexibility of qualitative research. And then last but not least is reporting, or analysis. So at the end of this whole process, we write reports, and we might write a top line. Video reporting has become very popular, and I think a very critical tool for a lot of our clients, because it allows them to see their clients talking about their products in their own voice. And it really brings to life for our clients what people are saying. But reporting is a critical piece, because it's what lives on past the research. So if you do the research and there are a few people involved with the research, those people know what happened. But this analysis, the report, is what people who weren't necessarily directly involved are going to read. They need to be able to understand what happened, what we learned. So what I often say is that the narrative of this document is extremely important. It has to tell a story. It has to be memorable. And it has to not only articulate what we learned, which is the what, but it also has to very clearly articulate why we, or more importantly, our clients, should care, which is the so what. And then it also typically should articulate, okay, what do we do now? What have we learned? We've learned something new. What do we do with this new information? So the now what. So it's really critical that we talk to those three different things and really tell a story that's memorable for our clients and understandable. Because in the course of, say, you're doing 6 focus groups over a week, there's so much that's learned, and it's important that the analysis has a clear narrative that tells the client of the key things. It's almost like an elevator speech when you think about the executive summary of a report, like just the key things that were learned, what they were, why they're important, and what they should do about what we learned. And so that's what reporting is. So that, in a nutshell, is the life cycle of a qualitative research project. So we've got defining the objective, the recruiting process, the discussion guide development, fielding the research, actually going out and talking to people, and then reporting and writing the analysis, and then summarizing what was learned in the course of the project. So that's the life cycle of a qualitative research project. And with that, we come to the end of this short webinar on the introduction to qualitative research. I hope that you have found some interesting tidbits throughout the course of the webinar. Thank you.